Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. Joining me today is my co-host, Angelo Giuliano. Hello, Angelo. How are you?
Hi, Brian. Just difficult times. It's very painful to see what is happening in the world. I think we are going through this inflection moment where what is happening in Palestine is not much different to what is happening in Ukraine. Is this transition between unipolar world, U.S. hegemony to multipolar world. So how you doing? How you handling with this emotionally? I think emotionally, I think we need to talk about emotions too. And I think what we want to bring here is that the rational side. Just trying to take a little bit of step back because there's lots of emotions. People are asking everyone to take sides. There's a gray area. I think it's now with cool head, we can maybe have a more pragmatic approach on what is happening right now in Palestine and what is next. What is next, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to welcome everyone who's tuning in live. Thank you so much. And we'll end up doing some questions and answers if we can remember to do it. And you're absolutely right, Angela. It's been a very difficult time. Anybody who's even partially following what is going on in Gaza right now, you're watching people basically being buried alive. They're transforming the Gaza Strip into a cemetery, and they're burying the civilian population there. And they're doing it by using what Hamas did on October 7th as a pretext. And they're also openly admitting that this is not really about getting Hamas. They say that it is, but at the same time, and I'm talking about the Israeli Defense Forces, representatives of the Israeli military openly saying that they're going to maximize damage at the expense of precision. So this is not going after Hamas. This isn't going after Hamas hard. This is using what Hamas did as a pretext to just mass murder the Palestinians in Gaza. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why are they doing this? And why are we watching this violence break out now? And what was going on in the Middle East before this happened? And what is the U.S. now preparing to do in the Middle East right now? Also using this as this whole conflict, this recent outbreak of violence, using it as a pretext. And I was listening to Alex Christoforo and Alexander Mercouris of the Durham, and they were talking about the U.S. military buildup in the region, which is very significant. As a matter of fact, let's I have some articles here, and we just take a look at some of these. This is from the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Defense, and they're talking about 900 U.S. troops in the process of mobilizing and moving to various U.S. bases across the Middle East. Many of these bases are illegal. They're illegally occupying Syria, for example. They're in Iraq. The government has told them to leave. They refuse to leave. And then they're also in the Persian Gulf, Arab monarchies. There's U.S. military bases there. And so they're building up. What kind of forces are they building up? Anti-air and anti-missile forces. And so what it looks like they're doing is they're preparing the battlefield to ultimately provoke Iran and its allies. And they're creating missile and air defenses in an attempt to mitigate the blowback from this provocation. And we'll get into that. I want to read from the 2009 Brookings Institution paper, Which Path to Persia. It's very important that people hear this, especially now. But getting back to what you were saying, Angelo, about emotions, we have to remember that the U.S. is very good at this. They're very good at manipulating the public on all sides of any issue. They're very good at doing it, and they depend on people being emotional rather than rational. They see what Israel is doing deliberately to the civilian population of Gaza, and they know it's going to create an irrational emotional reaction, and people are not going to think before they speak or do things. And it's not that you just let it happen. No, but you have to be, if you really want this to stop, you have to really think of a realistic way to make it stop. And right before we got going, Angelo, you were talking about the region normalizing with Israel and what impact that would have. Maybe you could get into that a little bit.
I think we need to look at the essence of Zionism. Zionism is an ethnocentric project. It's an apartheid project. It's a very racist project too. Uh, and the only way that Zionists can survive is by antagonizing, by having these threats uh, of the Arab world. And there's a very interesting actually channel, the Middle Nation channel. I think his name is Sahid. I forgot the name, but actually he's explaining that this whole concept of Zionism would actually fall apart completely once you have normalization of the relationship between Israel and the Arab world. And because ultimately Israel, this whole idea of racist state, ethnocentric state, would just look stupid, completely stupid. And I kind of like the idea. It makes actually a lot of sense. You see, see what they've tried for 75 years and it didn't work. Because Big Brother is there. It's always, as long as there's Big Brother, you have arrogant states like Israel and the same as Ukraine. Do you think for a second that the clown Zelensky would behave like this if Big Brothers was not on the back? It's the same for Israel. Israel is extremely arrogant, and they are playing with this. And when you look at the trade of Israel, most of the trade of Israel is not done within the region, because the whole region has isolated Israel. Now, when you integrate Israel within the region, you start trading, you start having investment. Well, what happens is that you start having some leverage, and you have common faith. That's the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, what China did. The only problem in integrating Israel within the region is that it's going to take time to have this Zionist project to fall apart, because it will fall apart. It's what we call an anachronism. It's one thing that we could understand 50 years ago when there was South Africa apartheid state. It doesn't make any sense in this world nowadays. So who would lose there would be the Palestinians, because are we going to sacrifice the next 20, 30 years, a whole generation of Palestinians living in an open-air prison? And also, it's really important for people to understand why we had the creation of Israel. It's an anomaly. It's what they did here. We need to go back to the 1907. There was a convention. It was the imperialistic conference. It was organized by the British Empire. And what they wanted to do in this conference was actually organized by Minister Harry Campbell Bannerman. And it was very clear. There was 4 points. They wanted to create a foreign entity. Again, we were not even talking about Israel. They wanted a foreign entity which would be in between, in the middle of the Arab world. The Arab nation was actually a monolith. We are talking about sharing the same religion, sharing the same language, but additional to that, they knew there were vast oil reserves. So there was a transition between going from coal to oil. It was a huge revolution about to happen. And the Arab world was in the hand of the Ottoman Empire. So what they did, they went to the Arabs and they said, we know what, we are going to help you to get you independence. So they put the Arabs against the Ottoman Empire. That was the idea. But they still wanted to divide the Arab world. So they wanted this foreign entity. I'm going to read you 4 points. What was the purpose of this foreign entity? To promote disintegration, division, and separation in the regions. First point. Second point, to establish artificial political entities that would be under the authority of the imperialistic countries. Imperialistic countries before was the British Empire. There was a switch to the US Empire. Third point, to fight any kind of unity, whether intellectual, religious, or historical, and taking practical measure to divide the region inhabitants. Fourth point, to achieve this, it was proposed that a buffer state should be established in Palestine, populated by a strong foreign presence, which will be hostile to its neighbors and friendly to European countries and their interests. Later on, what happens is that you had a person called Weizmann, which was part of the World Zionist project, actually got in touch with the British Empire and said, well, we could fulfill this function. But again, people that think that the Zionists or the Jews control the West or the US are completely wrong when they think about that. It's the other way around. Jews were just used. World War II, before World War II, keep in mind that most of the West was anti-Semite. You had in Madison Square in New York, you had 30,000 pro-Nazis that would gather. Actually the biggest enemy for the Western Empire was the communism. That was the biggest enemy. And again, who was actually for the creation of the Zionist entity was the West, but also Hitler. Keep in mind that Hitler wanted to expel the Jews from Europe. Now, I ask you a question. If you are Jew, you live in Europe, do you want to leave Europe and go to a state down south with nothing? You leave all your possessions. Would you want to do that? No, you don't. Whoever wants you to do that is not going to work for your interest. So if Jews are thinking that this was in their interest because the West cares for them, well, guess what? They are the most anti-Semites because they are going to use you. Not only you leave your country, because nobody wants to do that, and you are going to go to a foreign country, you are going to have to fight to steal their home, and they are going to use you to divide and conquer, and you are going to be at war because the Palestinians suffer way more, of course. But again, would you want to be a settler that is not, that is in enough artificial state? So it's really important to put everything into the context. Israel was being used the same as they are doing in Ukraine. Ukraine is an artificial state, same as Israel. And the only way that Israel can survive, if you really care about Israel, well, they need to be in peace, like they've been for hundreds of years, for thousands of years with the Arabs. The problem is not Israel. The problem is the Zionist, which is a racist, which is a dividing entity, which is creating chaos. And Israel still now, the only way Israel and the Zionist project can work, can be sustained, is by creating this antagonism with the Arab world. And you see, there's the what was the accord? The Abraham Accord, just to normalize the relationship. Well, I guess some people are maybe, in Israel, extremists, and outside Israel, they don't want that. So we need to question everything. Additional to that, I will add, and I'm finished then, is how did this happen? Because I have my great doubts. We touched this last time. It doesn't make any sense, everything that happened. And I think both sides are seeing what they want to see. But in reality, what happened is an anomaly. The Hamas did what they did was maybe a bait that was given by Netanyahu. And a lot of people, they chose to close an eye on what was going to happen. And there was no intervention. Keep in mind, for the next 6 to 7 hours, they did massacre. Hamas did its massacre, and nothing happened. They could have intervened in 15 minutes and close this whole thing.
It's extremely suspicious. But first, I want to get back to what you were saying, Angelo, about the creation of Israel and those 4 points that you brought up. And that is not unique to the creation of Israel. That is what the British Empire and now the United States, this is what they have done all around the world. This is what they've done here in Southeast Asia. You and I, Angelo, for years now, we've talked about how the U.S. creates all of these different groups, sets them against each other. It's called divide and conquer, a strategy of tension. This is what empire has done since the beginning of time. There's nothing mysterious about this. It has always been done. It was done by the British Empire. the U.S. picked up where the British Empire and also the French Empire left off. And they picked all of these up and they kept all of it going. Everything they were doing in Myanmar, which the British still to this day call Burma, the U.S. continues to this day, sometimes with the British helping. And the same goes for Israel. And you were pointing out about how, because there's misconceptions that I think I want to go over a list of common misconceptions that I see people bring up about this topic. And one of them is Israel controls Washington. Somehow they control Washington because they're allowed to do whatever they want. They're given all of this money. They can threaten anyone they want without consequence. They can demand anything they want, and it's immediately satisfied. But I just want people to stop and think about the last year and a half, now almost 2 years, in regards to Ukraine. Isn't that exactly what Ukraine has been doing since Russia began a special military operation? And maybe it started all the way back in 2014, this incredibly corrupt, incompetent regime in Kiev, the U.S. installed into power there, was getting away with literal murder. The U.S. and its allies allowed them to. And it wasn't because the Ukrainian lobby owns Washington. It's because Washington created this proxy regime in Kiev to overrun Ukraine and then transform it into a battering ram against Russia. Israel's a battering ram today against Iran and its allies, which also includes Russia now in the region, and to an extent, China. And this is what has made this whole process unsustainable. Angela, you were talking about normalization. As a matter of fact, we're watching the region, the Middle East, transform. We're watching it transform because China and Russia have stepped in. They have intervened. They have stopped the U.S. Military interventions, both direct and indirect proxy wars that they've been waging all across the region. They've given staunch U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia an alternative, and Saudi Arabia has begun pivoting toward that alternative away from its subordination to the United States and all of the proxy wars the U.S. dragged Saudi Arabia into. And the same was going to happen with Israel. And the only way to disrupt this process, this transformation of the Middle East, was to start a conflict exactly like this. And now we see the United States building up its military forces. And another thing that I heard Alex and Alexander of the Duran talking about was they're out of time. The U.S. is out of time. They have three primary focal points: Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan. Ukraine is falling apart. We've been documenting that extensively for now almost 2 years. That is irreversibly lost. The U.S. cannot change that. Russia is going to, they're just going to continue doing what they're going to do, and they are going to implement whatever it is that Russia's final goal is there. China has surpassed the U.S. in many ways, economically and militarily. The U.S. is not going to be able to pivot around and regain that lost ground. That is not going to happen. And every day that passes, it becomes more and more complicated for the U.S. to wage any kind of conflict directly or indirectly against China and come out winning. So what do they have left? The Middle East, Iran, Syria. If they can disrupt this process, they can set it back 10, maybe even 20 years. And they can throw a wrench into this transition from U.S.-led unipolarism to multipolarism, which is where the Middle East has been transitioning toward over the last several years. And again, I'm going to point to Saudi Arabia and Iran repairing their relations. We thought that they were mortal enemies who would never see eye to eye on anything, and they would wage war centuries into the future. No, it turns out that's not true. It is a product of U.S. coercion and political capture. And once you give a nation a way out, they will take it and they will go. Same was going to happen with Israel. There are elements within the Israeli government that benefit from being subordinated to the United States. They are going to work with the U.S. to disrupt this whole process. And I think that is what we see happening right now. And then Hamas is a large organization, is a political organization. It is also it has a militant wing, and it is not a well-organized military like, say, a standing nation states military. So there are many factions, including extremists, who are going to do things based on who is sponsoring them. If you look at Hamas, you see many nations, even nations opposed to one another, vying for influence over Hamas. We always hear about Iran influencing Hamas. If Iran had a large amount of influence over Hamas, it would look more like Hezbollah, and it would not have done what it did on October 7th. It would have possibly hit Israeli military positions and Israeli military personnel, but they would not have killed all of these civilians. They would not have kidnapped people. They would have done an operation more like Hezbollah would have. So who was behind this extremist faction that carried out this raid? And we've talked about this. We've talked about, here, let's take a look at this. And Angela, you could jump in if you want. This is from Haaretz. It's an Israeli-based newspaper, a brief history of the Netanyahu-Hamas alliance. And they talk about how not just Netanyahu, but many people that are in the same political faction, same vein of extremism as Netanyahu, they deliberately maneuvered Hamas into power, and they admit it. And they talk about how they allowed and assisted Qatar in funneling money to Hamas. They maneuvered them into power, and the reason was it was to hurt the more secular leadership in Palestine, and it was to make sure a two-state solution could never be arranged, could never be reached. And isn't that what the October 7th raids guaranteed? That the two-state solution will never happen as long as there's violence like that justifies Israel's brutality in return. They never have to even think about negotiating toward a two-state solution. Angela, is there anything you want to throw into that before I continue going?
Yeah, we touched last time about the nature of Hamas, who was funding them, the origin, the link with the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar funding, and basically, it was promoted by the West, the US, and Israel. But I want to add up again. Hamas ultimately is the legitimate force. They've been elected. It's the choice of Palestinians, and going from the perspective of Palestinians, Hamas is the only force. Again, on the 7th of October, Hamas was one of the forces, probably the largest force, but there were many different factions, Islamic jihadists. I mean, it's more complex than that. But if you look from a Palestinian perspective, someone who wants to fight for its land and against all the humiliation and so on, if the only force is Hamas, I get that. And again, I'm not even. I don't want you to criticizing what they did. What they did, only Palestinians know what they've been through. The whole humiliation, the stealing of their houses, all the humiliation, loss of dignity. They have no dignity, and I think for a second we need to, to look at the whole from. Put yourself into the shoes of Palestinians. What we want to do here is more like taking a higher view and really look at micro what is happening in Palestine, but within a context of this shift. Because again, this Palestinian issue, like many issues around the world, if you take the element of that big brother who's behind and is doing the divide and conquer, all the conflict, most of the conflict around the world would just stop, because then they can solve themselves, and it can be solved regionally, because only people regionally, they can solve their problems, and they have all the interest to do that. Every time you have a conflict, and you can see that many times you have India and Pakistan, you have the US like taking sides. Absolutely everywhere. Most of the conflicts, including in Africa, there's always the West, which is, country from the West, mostly the US, but sometimes, you have France doing that, for a few countries in Africa. Once you take that out of the equation, then a conflict like Palestine issue would actually probably be solved. This is why it's really important to, that the global South unites, and those conflicts, they could be solved. I don't see the other way around. You see, you wouldn't be able to solve the Palestinian issue if the US is still the global hegemony and still have this culture of divide and conquer. That's the problem is it's not even Israel, it's the US. Once you take that out of the equation, well, Israel wouldn't be able to fund, like its military. Because again, Israel every year is getting $4 billion and all the protection from the US. Do you think for a single second that Israel will keep on bullying Palestinians and being like so stubborn in its position, in its Zionist project, if Big Brother was not there? Everything would
Well,
change.
no, yeah, you're right, Angela. Here's the problem, and this is we were talking about this before we went live. 9/11. People would see what the United States has done all around the world, and they would say, 9/11, that's blowback. You deserve that. That's what you were doing to everyone else, and now you got to taste your own medicine. And I remember people, in a way, celebrating it. They were upset about the civilian lives lost, but they were saying, you brought this upon yourself. But in reality, we know that Al Qaeda, before that and after that, had been proxies of the U.S. They used Al Qaeda, number one, as proxies against their adversaries abroad, and also as a pretext to go into a country, invade a country, and occupy it. And that's exactly what the U.S. did after 9/11. So was 9/11, was that attack, was that really going to ever even threaten or slow down the U.S.? No, it was a pretext for the U.S. to accelerate everything that it was doing. And that is exactly how I see the October 7th raids by Hamas. And I've always said that the Palestinian people have the right to take up arms. They have a right to fight against occupation. I've gone over the UN resolutions that in a very clear-cut way point out that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory. They are in the wrong. They must stop their occupation. They must end their settlement activities. They must withdraw to their original borders, and they need to come to the table and negotiate a two-state solution. And the Palestinian people, until that happens, have the right to take up arms and defend themselves. And the interest that the U.S. and Israel have in co-opting the armed resistance and controlling it or directing it in a way that impedes their ability to actually protect the Palestinian people and instead perpetuate this chaos and this violence and the holding off of the two-state solution. They're obviously interested in doing that. They admit that they did that. They admit that they got involved with Hamas. And I have this on the screen. Hamas's sponsor is Qatar. And I want to remind people, Qatar and Al Jazeera played a very key role during the Arab Spring. And for years after that, all they did was support the U.S. proxy wars in Libya, in Syria, against the Iranians. That's what Al Jazeera did. And then they used the Palestinian cause to build up legitimacy all around the world. People right now are following Al Jazeera. And they are covering the Palestinian issue with passion, and they are drawing people in. And then when it comes time to support another U.S. proxy war against Syria or a nation like Syria, there will be Al Jazeera, Qatari state media, supporting the U.S., who is ultimately, as you say, Angelo, very correctly also, they are the ones that allow Israel to continue its brutality against the Palestinian people. Like you said, if there was no U.S. pumping in weapons and support and money, Israel could survive as a nation state without that support, but they just wouldn't be able to brutalize the Palestinians and pick fights with all their neighbors. They wouldn't be able to do that. They would have to find a foreign policy that made sense, was humane, within the confines of international law, which includes the two-state solution. They would have to do that. So it's very important for us to keep all of this in mind. It's not A or B. It's not, you either support Israel or you support Hamas. If you say Hamas was wrong to kill civilians on October 7th during those raids, it doesn't mean that you support Israel. It doesn't mean you don't support the Palestinian people's right to take up arms and defend themselves. So we have to be a little more sophisticated than that. So I think there's that. And I want to talk about Zionism, Islamic extremism, and Nazism. And also the supremacist mentality, I don't know if it has a name, an ism or not, that you see in Taiwan and Hong Kong, where these westernized Chinese people honestly believe they are superior to everyone else in China. The US deliberately encourages these toxic ideologies. And when you look at them at their core, they are identical. They're all exactly the same. There is superficial minutia surrounding and packaging each one of them. But at the core is this foreign-driven, toxic ideology that they use to poison people and get them to rally around these proxy governments the U.S. installs into power and sends the entire nation over the cliff, or in Taiwan's case, the Island province, sending it right off the cliff. So these are things that we've talked about at length, Angelo. Taiwan, Hong Kong, Ukraine, and people seem to get that. But then when we talk about Israel, for some reason, they can't get it. And I think it is that wall of emotions. One more thing, Angelo, I just want to put this up on the screen. Israel has the right to defend itself. So does every other country. Well, this is true, but it's not relevant to what's going on in Gaza right now. Israel's not defending itself by carpet bombing Gaza. By doing this, let's take a look at this. Where is it? Here. Let's take a look at this. Emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. That was the IDF spokesperson saying that. They're admitting that they're not actually going after Hamas. They're there to kill everybody. That's not self-defense. That is brutality. That is genocide. That has nothing to do with self-defense. Now, the problem with people who say things like this on the screen is that you have to recognize that Israel is illegally occupying Palestinian territory. The UN says so. International law says so. Even the US officially recognizes this. But just like the one China policy, they're double dealing, and they're officially recognizing it but undermining it at the same time. You have to recognize that, and the Palestinian people have a right to fight back against occupation. What Israel has the right to do is maybe defend against terrorists, but would Hamas even exist if they were not insisting on their illegal occupation of Palestine? No. And here's the question you have to ask yourself: if you truly support Israel and you want Hamas to disappear, what is the actual best, most rational, strategic way to make that happen? It is to eliminate the source of their existence, which means this injustice that Israel is a part of, encouraged by the US. You have to eliminate that. If you eliminate that, there's no reason for Hamas to exist. But Israel's never going to do that. So Hamas will continue to exist. So people have to see the reality of all of this, recognize that before they say things like this, which is too simplistic, and it has no basis in reality. Angela, you have anything you want to add?
No. Again, it's interesting how people they see, I mean, what they call like terrorism. I mean, just, well, do you think for a second, I mean, if we had, if Hamas had conventional forces, they would do what they did. Again, terrorism is very often what they like to call terrorism. And there's actually a very, a very specific definition for that. But,
one thing I wanted to make this very clear. What Hamas did when they were deliberately targeting civilians, that is just clear cut. It's a war crime. It's an atrocity, and you cannot excuse it, and people shouldn't excuse it, because what if Hamas is a puppet of Israel and Qatar and the US, and then they're doing this deliberately to hurt the Palestinian people, and you're cheering it on because you want to see Israel get its comeuppance, and for many reasons. So that's one thing. If Hamas only targeted Israeli forces, they would have had more resources to do so. It would have been much more successful militarily, and then Israel would have because they are illegally occupying under international law. They would have literally no justification for retaliating, because that was the Palestinians' right to defend themselves. So the person who said Israel has a right to defend themselves, Palestinian people have a right to defend themselves. And if they were solely attacking military targets, that's exactly what it would have been. So we have to be real careful and clear about that.
I have the impression that both extremists on both sides, they were looking for some type of Armageddon.
Yeah.
The Israelis, the extremists, they actually were welcoming somehow what happened, because that actually would fulfill and would be the right excuse just to wipe out, just to carpet bomb Gaza, and actually have a final solution. Let's call it what it is. That's a final solution. It would be the Palestinian Holocaust. But on the other side too, you have to think for a second. If you're Hamas and you did what you did, you knew the consequences. You know how extreme are the other side. And that's the problem, is that the extremists on both sides that are looking, that's very suicidal, looking for Armageddon. That's nothing else. Again, here, what you see, Hamas, what Hamas did, if the ultimate goal, and there was even 1% slightest possibility to win, maybe I could understand, but that's not, what is the outcome? That's a war you could never win. And that's my biggest question. Why would you do that? That's extremely suicidal. And you see the suffering. Here, if Israel is not stopped, we would have a calamity for the Palestinian people. We are talking about 2 million people. How many more deaths? Tens of thousands. But again, I think 50%, I don't know what is the rate, 40% of people that don't have a house. I mean, they're destroying everything. If they keep on doing like this, there won't be any, people will be living in tents. In a tent, 2 million people living in a tent. So that's the problem. So I have the impression sometimes that again, don't get me wrong. I know some people that would jump at me, that they'll be like, oh, are you pro Palestinian, pro,
yes,
the
yes,
usual thing. But I have so much the impression that Hamas has been a tool in this. It's been a tool. You fight a war, maybe if you can win, but here you cannot win. What was the purpose? Again, history maybe will tell me. History maybe, we don't know the outcome, but so far, yeah.
Actually, I want to, let's explore that a little bit, because southern Lebanon had been occupied by Israel. Hezbollah, which I would characterize as a very reliable, consistent resistance organization, they drove the Israelis out, and they have kept the Israelis out. And they're not all powerful. They're not able to stop the Israelis from, say, bombing Lebanon from north to south during the 2006 war. But they have kept the Israelis out, and they act as a deterrent against Israeli aggression and occupation. That is what Hezbollah does. That's what Hamas should be doing. That's what Iran wants to see Hamas transform into, which is why it attempts to influence the organization, which is why many countries around the world they don't condone what they did on October 7th, but they still talk to Hamas. It's not even recognized as a terrorist organization by the UN or many countries around. Pretty much everyone outside of the West doesn't recognize it as a terrorist organization, although they would characterize what they did on October 7th in terms of killing civilians, not their attacks on military facilities and personnel. They would characterize that as a war crime or an atrocity. So if Hamas had its weapons, was trading groups of armed men in Gaza, and they existed as a deterrent, which they do, and the other armed groups in Gaza do act as a deterrent. Look at how much preparation Israel has to undergo to contemplate an armed incursion into Gaza. And I went over the 2008-2009 Operation Cast Lead and Protective Edge in 2014. It was very problematic for Israel. So those armed groups do serve a purpose. In a way, they are winning, but just not in the way we think. And they're not going to, overpower the Israeli military, seize back occupied territory. But they can create a deterrence while this transition takes place in the Middle East, which was happening before this all started. So I just I've been giving a lot of thought to that since this all started. So I just wanted to kind of get that out there. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Angela. You can continue. Sorry about that.
No, I think we're pretty much online with this. The only thing is that there's not a clear-cut solution here, and I realize that as long as the U.S. is in the equation, we're sacrificing the life of Palestinians in a sense that they are humiliating on a daily basis, and it's atrocious. It's disgusting. But again, it's not about the best solution. It's a minor evil. It's a minor evil in waiting for this transition into multipolar world, where at some point you'll have, Israel, to make it a viable state, you will have to live in peace with Palestinians and with the region. and a lot of things, a lot of things are happening in the whole region. It seems there's a possibility, but I think, and it's extreme to say that while you have atrocious, crimes against humanity that are happening in Palestine, but I still think that normalization of Israel within the region, that could be a solution. It's counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive. If you're binary good bad, you cannot get there. It's about really reflecting, thinking how things could change. What is the solution? But as long as the US is there, you can't do much.
Yeah, I want to address this right here, because this is this binary thinking at play. How is Brian so skeptical of claims of Russian atrocities, but take claims of Palestinian atrocities at face value? Beheaded babies and raped women claims have been retracted. I've never claimed that there were beheaded babies or raped women. I haven't seen any compelling evidence regarding any of those claims. But I did see videos of Hamas shooting unarmed civilians, gunning down people in their cars as they were just driving by on civilian roads. And Hamas themselves admitted that anyone there, they're settlers, they're fair game. Which that doesn't work. You cannot say, if Russia was saying something like that, I wouldn't be so skeptical of Western claims. So the West has made up complete lies about what Hamas did on October 7th, and so there's that. But then there were also videos and Hamas itself admitting that they had done this. And again, why would you admit this? But then there were also the political elements of Hamas, who said they didn't even know about this operation. And we even have the Western media admitting that even Iran had no idea, because they're trying to link this to Iran. So that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Again, people have to they have to be fair. If you've already picked a side and you don't care what the truth is, you shouldn't be listening to us. We're trying to get to the truth, and what we want is an actual solution to this problem. When you cave into emotions and you just want revenge, that feeds directly into imperial divide and conquer. And that is what has fueled empires all throughout history. That is what fuels the US empire right now. If you want to break that cycle and bring all of this to an end, you have to recognize that weakness that we all have. We all have emotions. We're all outraged when we watch neighborhoods get flattened and we watch families get buried alive. It's outrageous. It makes you emotional, but you have to stay focused on the ultimate outcome that you want. If you want this to end, you have to be realistic about how it can be brought to an end, and you have to filter out all of this extra stuff that the U.S. is deliberately preying on to manipulate people. And I remember this very vividly all during the Arab Spring. When it first began, I was warning people that it was U.S. engineered years in advance. People didn't want to hear it. They just wanted to believe that the Arabs were rising up against U.S. and Israeli puppet regimes, and they didn't care what the truth was. And then we watched what the Arab Spring evolved into, what it was always designed to evolve into, and then people had regrets. And maybe if so many people weren't initially tricked, that momentum could have been stopped. And it would have been much more difficult for the U.S. to destroy Libya, to have destroyed Syria, and to have kept the momentum going for so long. The U.S. is still in Syria right now to this day. As a matter of fact, and maybe that's what we should, Angela, if you have anything else you want to add about this topic, but what I want to get into is what the U.S. might have up its sleeve regarding Iran, how they might be using this as a pretext to trigger some sort of conflict with Iran.
Yes, because
yeah, sure.
Well, because that's the goal. I just want to add, I think if we want to take an example for Israel and the solution for, maybe, under one state, we can look at the history of South Africa. This whole reconciliation process. It's possible. It's possible. Again, I think now people are still very emotional, but normalization ultimately, it is going to stop. It won't last. So we'll have to find solution. And I think a good example is South Africa. They did manage to have some reconciliation, and now it's a viable state. But I think it's really important now we shift to Iran because there's a bigger game. This Iran, next stage is Next step is how we can how the collective West is trying to frame Iran as being behind the Hamas, which is by the way, they even the U.S. government, they at some point they say at the beginning they said Iran is not involved. Now they're trying to find some connection, but Iran has nothing to do with Hamas. Was funded by Qatar. In many ways, is actually kind of an enemy. It's very, very different,
Well, yeah, and Angelo, it's funny because the U.S. is also they're trying to have it both ways at the same time. They have no evidence that Iran was involved, and I don't think that it was. And as I pointed out, Hamas turned against Syria, Iran, and Russia during the U.S. proxy war in Syria. They sent fighters to go join the U.S.-backed and armed militants in Syria against the Syrian government and Iranian fighters and backed fighters. So there's people have to keep that in mind. But they're also trying to say that this has nothing to do with Israel. This situation is being taken advantage by Iran and militants that it backs. They're attacking the U.S. bases that are illegally occupying Syria, and I would say also Iraq. And the U.S. has a right to defend themselves, just like that other person saying Israel has a right to defend its illegal occupation. The U.S. has a right to defend its illegal occupations in Syria, and so they're going to fight back against Iranian-backed militant groups and Iran itself. And maybe this is a good time for me to go over this. And if people used to follow my work when I wrote under a pen name Tony Carlucci, I used to talk about Which Path to Persia all the time. And it's available for free. And here's the PDF online. And it was written in 2009. So keep that in mind when I read this. I was just going to read this first part, and then maybe, Angelo, you can jump in and tell me what you think. This is what this U.S. government arms industry funded think tank wrote in 2009. It said it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for the airstrikes before launching them. So they're talking about airstrikes they already plan to launch, but they just need some sort of justification to launch them. This is what they're admitting in this policy paper. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. One method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in hope that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could then be portrayed as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression. So let me explain something to you before we go on. The U.S. for decades has wanted to overthrow the Iranian government, and it manufactures pretext to do so. Iran is not the problem. The U.S. is the problem. It wants to overthrow the Iranian government and subordinate Iran to the United States, like it tried to do to Iraq and Syria and Libya. And what Iran has done over all of these years has been defending itself. Angela, you have anything you want to add before I continue reading? Because there's some very interesting things in this U.S. government-funded.
No, go ahead. Well, I think Iran is also has a very strategic position, and so huge oil reserve, and it has huge deals with Russia and China. So it has a very critical position there. If the U.S. would be able to get their hand, put a U.S. puppet there, which they did in the past. They used to have their own U.S. puppet there. There would be a major blow against BRICS and against the multipolar world.
Absolutely. And why I recommend people look at a world map and look at where Iran is, and then look at what Nazi Germany tried to do in their war against the Soviet Union. They attacked on the Eastern Front, where the U.S. is right now waging proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. They also were trying to go through North Africa, the Middle East, and into Iran to attack Russia up through the south. And that didn't go very well at all. But that is exactly what the U.S. is trying to do now. In modern times, the U.S. is doing a slow motion hybrid warfare version of the Nazi blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union during World War II. That, if you really think about it and look at a map, that is exactly what is going on here. So let's continue reading this. It says, in a similar vein, any military operation against Iran will likely be very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. The best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudging or covert, is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction. And what they're saying is lie to people, convince people that this is real. Widespread conviction that the Iranians were given but then rejected a superb offer, one so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Under those circumstances, the United States or Israel, it says, or Israel, could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger. And at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it upon themselves by refusing a very good deal. This was 2009, before anyone was talking about the Iran nuclear deal. This paper was crafted, this policy was crafted during the Bush administration. Obama became president. It was under his administration that this fake nuclear deal was signed with Iran. From the very beginning, before it was even proposed, the U.S. planned to sabotage it, blame the Iranians, and use it as a pretext to go to war against Iran. And then under the Trump administration, this plan was brought to its full circle. The U.S. unilaterally left the nuclear deal, and then Biden said he was going to restart it, but he never did, because that was the plan, was to scrap it and then use the aftermath as a pretext to wage war on Iran. You got anything you want to add to, again, 2009, and this paper, word for word, has been implemented every year since then. Angela, you have anything you want to add before I go on?
The agreement was the JCPOA, right?
Yes.
It's another of those deals, like the same as a Minsk agreement. You go through negotiation, you sign an agreement, and then those agreements that are not meant to be kept. It's just to gain time and just to fool people. So at the end of the day, it's really worrying when you have 85% of the world. Collective West is roughly 15%, right? The rest of the world is watching that. Who would ever believe again in the collective West? Every time they sign an agreement, which is approved by the UN, which is registered at the UN, and they don't comply all the time. No, it's not credible. Who would sign again a deal? Iran wouldn't. Russia would sign again a deal. No, it's over. We cannot trust. They cannot trust each other in the first place. They lie to each other. So there's a huge lack of credibility. And again, we are, being part of the collective West, we are on the wrong side of history. We need to move on. But in terms of morality, it makes me think of who was this skater, US skater? She because she wanted to win so badly, Tonya Harding, right? She wanted to win so badly. The only way she could win was to blow up the kneecap of her opponent. And that's how I feel. I feel that, see, they're trying to fight China. How do? They spend $500 million on negative news on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's the strategy of the loser. You lie, you cheat, you steal, like Pompeo said.
Absolutely. All very good points. And I just want to impress upon people the Brookings Institution, RAND, CSIS, these are the people that actually craft U.S. foreign policy. The corporations that actually drive U.S. foreign and domestic policy, they craft these papers in these think tanks. Then they go with lobbyists. Lawyers draft them into bills. Lobbyists take the bill to Washington to get it rubber stamped, and the media sells it or shoves it down the American people's throats. Just keep that in mind as I read this 2009 paper. Now, I remember, again, recent videos from the Duran, they're talking about how Russia, China, they're in Iran, they're meeting together ahead of whatever's to come. And they're talking about how they're probably telling Iran to be patient and show restraint, even though they also admit that Iran probably already knows this. They don't need to be told this. And this is the biggest fear the US has. In this policy paper, they admit that is their biggest fear. It says, it would not be inevitable that Iran would lash out violently in response to an American air campaign, but no American president should blithely assume that it would not. However, because many Iranian leaders would likely be looking to emerge from the fighting in an advantageous and strategic position as possible, and because they would likely calculate that playing the victim would be their best route to that goal, they might well refrain from such retaliatory missile attacks. And we're watching the US right now prepare the ground in the Middle East for some sort of attack on Iran. And they've already carried out strikes on militant groups targeting illegal US military bases in the region. And this 2009 paper, I mean, it sounds like it could have been written yesterday. And then the next thing I want to go over is the role this policy paper has for Israel. They wanted to use Israel just like the US is using Ukraine as a proxy. But Angela, is there anything you want to throw in there before I read this part about Israel?
No, I just want to add, there's lots of papers, done by those think tanks, which are the same papers that politicians, read, but are actually funded by the military-industrial complex. Everything is out there. If you want to know what was going to happen in Ukraine, you have to go to 2019. What was the name? Containing Russia, the Rand Corporation. They said everything they were about to do. So Iran is not much different. In China, the same. How they are going to use Taiwan against China. So that's the one of the positive thing about the US is some type of level of
very transparent.
Well, it's transparent in a sense that they have some policies that they need to be transparent in terms of funding, in terms of strategy, and what you can imagine, from a Russian and Chinese perspective, they can read those papers, so they know exactly where their opponent's going.
Yeah, and it's not even a mystery. I mean, this is all when you read these papers and then you listen to the president or people in Congress talking about foreign policy, you can tell that they're just reading right out of these papers. And the problem is, global empire is not something you can do behind closed doors. It requires, however small the fraction of 1% is that runs the US, it's still a lot of people, and they have to build consensus among them. And they know ordinary Americans are not watching the Brookings Institution's YouTube channel, these 3-hour-long forums that I watch them. I have to watch it. It's not by choice. I watch them. I read these papers that are, 100. This one is 170 pages long. I've read it multiple times just to make sure. But they know the average American isn't going to, and they know the average American, even when they hear someone like me trying to pass out manageable quotes from the paper, most people still aren't going to get it or care. Let's talk about the role Israel is to play as the provocateur, the proxy provocateur. It says an Israeli air campaign against Iran would have a number of very important differences from an American campaign. First, the Israeli Air Force has the problem of overflight transit from Israel to Iran. Israel has no aircraft carriers, so its planes must take off from Israeli air bases. It also does not possess long-range bombers like the B-1 or B-2, or huge fleets of refueling tankers, all of which means that, unlike the United States, Israel cannot avoid flying through someone's airspace. The most direct route from Israel to Iran's one of the nuclear facilities is roughly 1,750 kilometers across Jordan and Iraq. As the occupying power in Iraq, the United States is responsible for defending Iraqi airspace. And the U.S. is still occupying Iraq. It's probably for this reason, to make sure no government gets into power that is going to close its airspace to an Israeli transit across their airspace, and to make sure that Russia doesn't send them S-400s to shoot them down. It continues. It says, from the American perspective, this negates the whole point of the option distancing the U.S. from culpability, because they're talking about how they use Israel to do things to make it very foggy that the U.S. was involved. It's a proxy. They're using Israel as a proxy, just like they're using Ukraine. It's in black and white here. And it says it could jeopardize American efforts in Iraq, thus making it a possible non-starter for Washington. Finally, Israeli violation of Jordanian airspace would likely create political problems for the king, one of America's and Israel's closest Arab friends in the region. And so they're talking about how this wouldn't be optimal, but they're still talking about how it would be possible. It also says an Israeli attack on Iran would directly affect key American strategic interests. If Israel were to overfly Iraq, both the Iranians and the vast majority of people around the world would see this strike as abetted, if not authorized by the United States. I think at this point, everyone understands that Israel and the U.S. are they're the last ones standing in the Middle East, irrationally isolated. So I think the gig is up, and they think what they're doing now is they're out of time, and they don't really care about optics, and that's what they're preparing for right now, is to finish this policy that they articulated in this paper in 2009. They want to finish it, and at this point, I don't think that they care. They care. Who knows? At this point, they're trying to kind of spin it, but not really. I mean, Angela, do you get that sense?
Yeah, I have the impression it's just at some point it's this idea: if you cannot win, you just might as well just turn the whole region into rubble. That's my impression. It's they cannot win, might as well just destroy it, and
deny it to Russia, China, and multipolarism. Just deny the whole region,
or just delay the development. You destroy the whole thing, and it's going to take. Gets those countries back to 10, 15 years. We saw what happened with Libya. And again, you mentioned just before Iraq, the parliament of Iraq, they said clearly at the unanimity, they wanted the US troops to leave. So it's interesting. Yes. The US imposed democracy, new type of democracy in Iraq. Then you have everybody saying, well, we want you out, and the US is still there. So much for democracy and sovereignty, right?
Yes, and I only got one last paragraph to read from this paper. I mean, there's so much in this paper. We could go on for 3 hours over this, but I just want to do this one last part, and I want to get and then we could take some questions. It's already 1 hour. Angela, are you in a rush, or can you do another 30 minutes
or
so?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, so this 2009 paper says the Israelis may want to hold off until they have a peace deal with Syria in hand, assuming that Jerusalem believes that one is within reach, which could help them mitigate blowback from Hezbollah and potentially Hamas. Consequently, they might want Washington to push hard in mediating between Jerusalem and Damascus. That was 2009. They knew that was never going to happen. What they organized instead, and what they were already in the process of organizing, even as this paper was being written and then published, they were already planning an engineered proxy war against Syria to overthrow the government there, because they wanted to get Syria out of the way before they isolated and focused on Iran. That was the whole point of this. That has been the whole point of the Arab Spring, was meant to rearrange the entire region to create a united front against Iran, just like the US has been meddling here in Asia to create a united front against China. And I just want to show people what happened during the Arab Spring. So this happened during the Arab Spring. Hamas ditches Assad, backs Syrian revolt. This was backed by the US and Israel. So Hamas was joining forces essentially with the US and Israel, and also Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar. How about this one? This was 2013. Egypt cuts ties to Assad regime and calls for support of rebels. And this was after the Arab Spring overthrew President Hosni Mubarak, and then Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood became president. And one of the first things he did was cut ties with Syria and throw in support behind the terrorists trying to overrun Syria, who were part of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Hamas is also rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not hard to imagine how all of this works. You see the evidence, and this went on for years and years. This went on, and then when Mohammed Morsi was ousted in a military coup, and President and also General Sisi took power, one of the things his government did was restore ties with Syria and take Egypt off that united front against Iran track that the US had created. And the whole purpose of the Arab Spring was to rearrange the region, aim it at Iran, eliminate Iran, and then, as John McCain said, the Arab Spring is a virus whose ultimately its destination is Moscow and Beijing. And this is what you and I have been talking about for years, Angelo. This global campaign the U.S. is on to do regime change, reshape regions, isolate Russia and China, eliminate their allies, Iran being one of them, and then eventually dividing and destroying Russia and China. And then they have their, they solidify and preserve their unipolar world order. Anything to add to that, Angelo?
No, it is sad if you think about this whole history about the Arab world, how they've been fooled all the time. They were occupied for a long time, and then they antagonize. They say, well, they promised self-determination, and they never left. It's just this imperialism just changes, and it has become more subtle. So also boundaries, the way they when the colonial power they left, they made it on purpose just to draw the line so they would divide countries. Kurdistan is split into 3-4 different countries on purpose. Iraq, they denied the access to the sea to Iraq. They created this artificial country, which is Kuwait. All those things. You had the Shia in Iraq. Naturally they should have joined the Shia in Iran, but they did it on purpose. They created those artificial states, and just to make sure that especially the Arab world will never be united.
Absolutely. And Angela, we talk about this all the time. We talk about how they did the exact same thing in Myanmar. They set it up for failure. Even the Philippines, they gave them their independence. The U.S. used to be a literal colony of the U.S. They gave them their independence, but they created all of these ethnic, religious, political divides within the Philippines, ensuring that they would never unify and actually be able to climb out from under the shadow of U.S. hegemony. This is from The Atlantic, November 2011. The Arab Spring, a virus that will attack Moscow and Beijing. And it was engineered by the U.S. and the U.S. eventually admitted it. The New York Times did a whole article out on the National Endowment for Democracy and the State Department and Google, Twitter, Facebook. They were all working with the agitators who led the beginnings of those protests years in advance. They all sent them back to the respective countries to overthrow, basically destabilize the whole region and pave the way for these wars. Seymour Hersh wrote an article for The New Yorker in 2007 about how the U.S. was working with all these extremists, including the Muslim Brotherhood, even Al-Qaeda, and they were creating an army that would be used once the cover of these protests was given. The armed militant groups would come in, and the U.S. would have multiple proxy wars. So please keep all of that history in mind. I had been writing about it since it began in 2011. I've been trying to get people to understand how the U.S. was incrementally encircling and containing Russia and China at the same time. And now they're openly talking about this, much more openly now, because again, I think time is up and they don't have the luxury of trying to keep everything covered up and spinning everything. They have to move now. They're out of time. Let's see. I'm gonna look for some. We got a whole bunch of questions actually. Let's just start with this one. Is the U.S. military presence needed in the Middle East anymore? Arab states and Iran get together. Well, it was never needed. It was never needed. It was an imperial adventure, military adventure to conquer and subordinate the region. So it was never needed, and it most certainly is not needed now. And more importantly, it's unsustainable. And what the U.S. is trying to do, what I imagine it's doing, we're not going to know until it unfolds. But what I imagine this whole Hamas-Israel conflict that is obviously designed to escalate out of control, what they're trying to do is one last attempt to reassert themselves in the region, because otherwise the whole region is moving on without the U.S. Angela, have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, in terms of protection, actually, we have right now Russia, which is stepping in. For example, you see, with Saudi Arabia has a security agreement with Russia. So I think what those countries are going to do is not siding completely, because the idea is not to replicate, this multipolar, okay, I'm with you or and against you. The idea is that they leverage, they balance their relationship. So it's not going to be, I don't think Saudi Arabia would cut completely tie with the US. So they will manage, it's about hedging their bets. So you have security agreements with the US, but at the same time you have security agreements with Russia. And we see the same in Africa. They're not jumping all the way, it's a matter of trust and also sovereignty. If you want to be a sovereign state, you need to hedge your bets. And I think this is why the Russia is such a problem for the US, because they're coming in and they are the branch of, in terms of security. So you see China is the role of the deep pockets finance, and Russia is fulfilling the role of in terms of security. You need security, we can coach you, we can sell you weapons. And that's a new element. There was a tacit agreement for a long time between the Washington Consensus, the IMF, the World Bank. They really wanted to make sure that those countries in the global south could not buy weapons, and so they put lots of constraints, especially in terms of defense spending to the GDP. But now actually, I think the gloves are off, and Russia is stepping in and is actually starting to sell weapons and providing security. So those countries they can actually hedge their bets, and we've seen what is happening in Africa. You see, Ukraine, Africa, Palestine. I don't know if it's they got emboldened. I don't know, but many things are happening, and de-dollarization. I mean, those are clear signs that countries are emboldened, and now they are going to hedge their bets. They're probably not going to take all the sides, China, pro-Russia, but now they want to have more balanced relationship.
Yes. And you can see the balance of power around the globe is shifting. It is more equitable. Russia would not have been able to do what it's doing in Ukraine right now 20 years ago. That would have been impossible. The world is changing. The US refuses to change with it. They refuse to recognize what is happening and to find a rational place within a multipolar world. They insist on pursuing unipolarism and trying to reassert it. Here is a question. No organic Arabic impetus for the Arab Spring. No. There were plenty of reasons for people to be upset, but people don't just spontaneously all come out of their house all at the same time. And for good protests or bad protests, all require organization and resources. It doesn't just happen on its own. And these protests, we know the names of the leaders and the organizations, and we have documented evidence regarding the US government funding years in advance before it ever unfolded. It's a clear, again, back then, nobody wanted to admit that it was US engineered. They wanted to believe that it was real. It wasn't real. I'm sorry, it wasn't. And most times it isn't. It's just like the Euromaidan. It's completely fake, completely engineered. Yes, there's people there that believe what they're doing, but they've been tricked and duped into it by the US and the opposition groups and the opposition media. The US funds millions and millions of dollars in each and every one of these countries. Go to the NED's website, ned.org. Where we work, they're in a country near you, guaranteed.
I want to add one more thing, Brian, to those revolutions, information space. Arab Springs was all in social media, because the Western, the US controls, social media. They pumped so much money, and the revolution happened in social media. You can control everything through social media. So this is why we need, and repeat that many times in this show, is that sovereignty, it's not only boundaries, physical boundaries, but it's also in terms of information space. If any country wants to protect its sovereignty, it needs to control its information space. So this is why China is smart to have a firewall. It's not to control the people, but ultimately, if you allow funding from outside and you allow Western states to control your information space, and you can create a revolution. You need to protect that. And that's what the Global South needs to do. Right now, it needs to step in and just control all those social media, from Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, everything. They need to have tougher law in terms of national security.
Absolutely. And Angelo, you're from Hong Kong. You watched the U.S. sponsored agitators in the streets. And then you watched the national security law pass, and you watched them uproot all of this foreign interference, and you watched stability return. Right? I mean, it really is that simple. And did the kids have certain good reasons to be out protesting? Yes, but they were co-opted. The whole thing was engineered. They're upset, but going out into the streets and burning your own city down is not how you solve it. There's constructive ways of dealing with that.
Yeah, and I want to keep on repeating. We repeat that all the time. In terms of ideology, we just do not care. We do not care. I have sometimes a shirt like communist, which that's just for provocation, by the way. I've seen some comments, but what I'm saying is that if you really respect those countries, you need to think in terms of self-determination.
Yeah.
If you just think for a second, if in Palestine, I think it's a good example, Brian. If in Palestine and also in Israel, you had no foreign elements. I'm talking about influence, financing, sending weapons. I mean, Big Brother behind and so on. Everything would never happen. Zionist is actually a foreign element. It's not endemic.
Artificial.
It's not organic. It's artificial. So what we're standing for is self-determination. Once you have self-determination, everything changes, including the class struggle. I mean, everything. Ultimately, who am I as a foreign person to judge? What I'm saying is that let those people to decide for their fate, and that's the whole idea of self-determination. And when you look at the approach of China, is exactly this. It's what happened in your home stays in your home. Live and let live. And that's the whole idea of multipolar world. You see, China, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, doesn't want to step in. I'm neutral in this. There's probably some boundaries, sometimes a type of national security law, national security, because Russia is a strong partner. But ultimately, if you have the attitude of China, I think they used to call it Westphalian, relationship. Live and let live. I mean, the whole world would be so much better. If you're a family, you stay in your home and you deal with only you know what is good for your home, your family, to have a peaceful family. And I see that in terms of nation. If your neighbor comes to your home, what does he know about your home? Is that his business? So, and then the relationship between you and your neighbors are going to be in terms of interest. If we have interest to deal together, if we get along, then it's good. If we don't get along, well, it's fine, But don't import your problem to my home. You have problems in your home, leave it there. Live and let live.
Yes, absolutely. I just want to, before we get back to the questions, I was in the U.S. Marines when 9/11 happened. I swept away emotionally by it, like everyone else around me. And I was told that Islam was the enemy. And despite how brainwashed I was always a student of history. I was a student of the art of war. And in the art of war, it says, know yourself and know your enemy. So I thought, if Islam is my enemy, I need to know it. And I went to the chaplain. The chaplain has a copy of every book, including the Quran. And I read it cover to cover. And I saw these so-called hate verses. And if you read the verse before it and the verse after it, and you put it in context, as a completely different meaning. And that was one of the pivotal moments where I woke up and I said, we are being lied to. It says, live in peace with your neighbor. God is the only one who can judge anybody. If they come to hurt you, lay waste to them. If they ask for forgiveness, forgive them, because God will forgive them. That's what almost every one of these so-called hate verses is preceded and followed by. And it's malicious liars who prey on racist idiots who are never going to pick up a Quran. We're just going to read the hate verses and not not see it in any sort of context, those are the people they'll recruit into the war on terror. And actually, that was on my list of things that I wanted to talk about. I see so many people who are saying, Brian, your analysis on Ukraine is amazing. I love it, but you're completely wrong about Israel. And then they start rattling off war on terror era propaganda. And it's just so disheartening to see people can wake up to what they're being lied to about regarding Ukraine, and then they could go to the exact same sources and buy into whatever they're saying about Israel or China. I mean, that's a problem we've always talked about, Angelo. People get Ukraine, but they don't get China, or they get China, but they don't get Ukraine. And they turn to the same sources that they know are lying to them about something else. They turn to those same sources and buy into the lies regarding something else. It's very, very disheartening.
We always have the same approach, is the funding and to whom benefits the crimes, and this whole idea of divide and conquer. But you see, we've done, when it comes to terrorism, we've exposed terrorists pretty much everywhere. In Myanmar, in China, the same. But very often these terrorists, where does it come from? It's about, you can start from very often they start from legitimate grievances and they amplify it. Because problems, every single country has a problem, including China. They come in and they might be a few issues, and they are going to amplify. 1989, Tiananmen Square, it started as grievances because of the reforms, and then they hijacked movements. In Maidan, what did they do? There were frustration about corruption, but somehow they started from corruption through a movement, neo-Nazi movement, and then you don't need millions of people. Maidan was maybe thousands of radicals that took over. Only thousands. That's what you need. In Syria, the same. You need because most of the people, just think about it. 99% of the people are not violent. If there are confrontation, most people, they want to retreat. They like, let it leave, But they don't realize that if you don't step in and stay stuck to this, you can have a case of Maidan that leads to hijacking of a democracy by the US, and then we are at 500,000 dead. I tell you one thing, if in Maidan people knew that not stepping into Maidan against this foreign interference, and that it would lead to 500,000 deaths, I tell you, most Ukrainians would never accept Ukraine the way it is now.
But people don't. They get swept away by the emotions. And here's this one. Jews in the U.S. started the war on terror. Neocons are Jews, except no substitute. This is false. It's an assumption that the billionaire ruling class in the United States has no interest in conquering and subordinating the Middle East. It's only the Jews that want to do it. The West, the rest of the West has no interest in controlling where the vast majority of hydrocarbons comes from. No interest at all. But just remember, long, long, long before Israel ever existed, the British Empire was bent on controlling the Middle East. Before that, the Roman Empire. Was it the Jews all throughout human history? I mean, is there some sort of superpower that we don't know about, that just they're the only ones that are greedy? And the poor innocent ruling class of the of the United States, the poor billionaires are being victimized by these Jews. It's just so ridiculous, and I'm tired of seeing people have to be smarter than this. And if you're not smart, I mean, you're on the wrong channel. Maybe you go find where David Duke is posting videos these days. I don't know. This is ridiculous.
I think this globalist agenda. The globalist elites, by definition, are global. They don't care about nationalities. They do not care. It's about having hundreds of families that want to create this global market and destroy a nation state, and it's a project of control. It's a project of originally the 1% against the 99%, but if we go this way, it's going to be the 0.01%. It's going to be an infinite minority controlling the rest. So again, I think it's important just to keep reminding people that's we talk about nations, but very often nations are tools. Ultimately, it's going to be about destruction of nation state and globalist elites, including global corporation, having a control over the masses. I think that's the ultimate goal. That's the ultimate goal. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the thing is, if you live in Asia, for example, you see all of the exact same things happening, and there's no Jewish people here. So why it's human nature. I feel like this is something that I really wish people would understand. And I thought for a moment that when they saw Ukraine acting the way that it does, exactly as Israel acts, and also the way Taiwan to a great extent act, they feel like they have impunity. They can be as corrupt as they want. They can censor anyone they want. There's no repercussions because the U.S. chose them as their proxy. They can't be bothered they don't care what they're actually doing. They're just using them. And so they get away with everything. And I thought people would wake up when they saw Ukraine, but some of this is just way too deep. Let's try to burn through some of these questions. Would it be difficult for Russia and Iran to operationally destroy those aircraft carriers? I would say yes. And I think Russian President Vladimir Putin made it very clear there's MiG-31s with Kinzhal hypersonic missiles basically designed to sink aircraft carriers. So there's that. And there's also submarines that Russia has. I believe Iran has some submarines too. I think, the aircraft carrier at this time is extremely vulnerable, but no one wants to sink it because of the implications of doing so. But if the U.S. overreaches, it's a possibility. It's a possibility.
What do you think about the possibility, Brian, of Israel using a tactical nuclear bomb if it starts saying, well, this is an existential threat, and maybe Iran? That's my biggest fear, to be honest, is Israel invoking national, existential threat and actually having a tactical nuclear bomb on Iran.
Yes,
actually, if there is a single country and a single friction, that would be the right example where and I'm not afraid of North Korea, but I'm afraid of Israel dropping a nuclear bomb on Iran.
Yeah, actually, I've been giving this a lot of thought. Contrary to popular belief, the U.S. does not care what happens to Israel. If Israel is eventually going to pivot away from the U.S. and find its place within a multipolar Middle East, the U.S. would rather see it get destroyed. They have nuclear weapons. They have all of these capabilities. The U.S. has helped them build up over decades. They want to use them now, even if it comes at the expense of Israel's existence. Look at Ukraine. I don't know. And look at Taiwan with the same U.S. think tanks writing papers that I just was reading from. They have written papers about Taiwan, how the entire island will be scoured of human life, infrastructure, and industry. There will be nothing left, but it'll still be politically independent of the rest of China, because the U.S. does not care what happens to the people in Taiwan. They do not care, obviously, what happens to the Ukrainian people. They openly say to the last Ukrainian, the smiling ear to ear, and they have the exact same sentiment for Israel. I guarantee it, and I guarantee we will see that happen. So that is also my biggest fear, that they will use nuclear weapons, because it's this opportunity that they only have now, a very small window of opportunity. And then once it pivots away, they will never get this opportunity again. It's just too good not to at least think about. This is a very good point, Angelo. The Hannibal Doctrine, how it was employed after October 7th. Well, this I've read about this. I'm not an expert on this, but it seems to be if there are Israelis that are in danger of being captured, Israel will just flatten an entire neighborhood with artillery and other long-range weapons. They don't care what happens to the civilian population. But I don't think that's what we're looking at. I think we're just watching a deliberate campaign to just kill everybody in Gaza. That's what I think is going on there. Is the U.S. going to build up forces and then a major blockade of Iranian oil with an airstrike looking for justification? Well, here's the thing about this. I think with airstrikes alone, you're not going to really achieve anything. But what the U.S. might be, and just as we were reading from Brookings, what they hope to do is provoke Iran into a reaction that they could use to marshal the Western public into a major war, just like 9/11. Imagine if U.S. aircraft carriers were actually sunk after a U.S.-Israeli airstrike all across Syria and Iran. Imagine, and we're not even sure who sank the aircraft carriers. Let me just say that it is just as possible an Israeli missile could sink one of these aircraft carriers as an Iranian or Russian missile. So it could be a ploy to justify a much larger campaign. I mean, ultimately, the U.S. needs to put huge numbers of ground troops if they want to achieve anything permanent in the region. I believe that Syria has proven, Lebanon has proven, and I think Iran is prepared to prove that they can survive even the most extensive Western air campaigns. Angela, have anything?
Yeah, I think probably Russia is bringing some help to Iran. I think they're smart. They know what they're doing. Keep in mind that the game is you're not going to give the satisfaction to your enemy to have the reaction he wants you to have, right? What they want, what the US wants, is an escalation. Just think about all the brutality. The brutality, what they are doing in Gaza is that they want to have the whole Arab world to raise.
Yes.
And if their governments don't do anything, then maybe they might topple their government. And they want an escalation. That's what they want. So what Russia is probably telling Iran leaders is just be careful. Just wait, because time is on our side. You see, time is on the side of the global south and the multipolar world. And they're panicking. What the US is doing is they're panicking because it's not sustainable. $31 trillion debt. It's increasing exponentially. It's not sustainable. And the economy is collapsing. The dollar is collapsing. And Biden is going to lose the elections. I think there's internal reasons too, corruption and so on. And Netanyahu the same. See, I mean, people are unhappy. So what you do, you create a problem outside, and maybe, they're hoping for the best. They're hoping that things might change. But it's a vicious circle, and it shows clearly that the West is panicking. And what saddens me is that all those U.S. puppets following blindly. I'm thinking about especially Europe. They've been fooled. It's so shocking. Think about Europe.
Speaking of Europe,
they've been fooled when it comes to Ukraine. It was, blowing the Nord Stream 2. I mean, so much. They're going to be deindustrialized. They are going to buy expensive gas. And now you want to go to Israel? You have German troops wanting to go to help Israel.
With what weapons? What do they have left after they've transferred most of their military to Ukraine?
Just think about the message. We have open-air concentration camps, and now there are rumors of Israelis using maybe nerve gas, just to fight Hamas. I mean, just think about the visual. Do you have a visual in mind? The symbol of having concentration camps and Israelis using gas. Wow! Just think about.
Yeah. I mean, even just what they're doing.
Survivors, if there are Holocaust survivors, looking at what Israel is doing to Palestinians, open air prison bombing, carpet bombing, killing kids, and then you want to gas them? Wow! It's crazy. The world has gone mad.
Yeah, and even if there is no gas, the bombing alone is bad enough. And speaking of Europe, Angela, you were just talking about Europe. Do you think Germany is regretting taking Nord Stream for the European team? And this is exactly what I was just talking about. The U.S. does not care about its allies, and it has no allies. They're all proxies, and the U.S. will use them at their own expense to spare the U.S. having to pay the cost. And so, yes, they have completely destroyed Germany's economic prospects well into the future. And that if they did that to Germany, why does anyone think that Israel is going to be special? So this is what makes me worry a lot, Angela, about what you said about Israel and their nuclear weapons and what they might try to do with this quickly closing window of opportunity before the whole region kind of pivots away. Let's see. How about this one? Russia has been extremely patient with the West, preferring not to escalate. Do you think this will change if Putin dies? I don't think Russia is Russian President Vladimir Putin. Obviously, he's an iconic leader, but I believe he has created institutions that will be able to survive him and continue with what he's doing. I think a lot of people in Russia can see very clearly the benefits of being patient and persistent, which is what Russia has been doing all along. And if you look at Russian history, there's a whole history of that, a culture of that. Same with China. So I hope it doesn't change if that were to happen. And I tend to think that it will not change. Angela, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, the way Putin has been dealing with Ukraine was he has been dealing as a war being a prelude to peace. He's actually fighting a war with Ukraine, preparing for the peace, the coming peace with Europe. See how much wisdom there is. While Europe is throwing everything in, including Russophobia, absolutely everything. It's like there's no tomorrow. I have the impression that you have mature people, leaders in both Russia and China. They're looking like, I have the impression they see like kindergarten kids, like being the Europe, the collective West, they're fighting each other and so on. And it's like, well, it's going to pass. It's a kid. Those are kids that have a tantrum and somehow they're going to grow up. And then, in the meantime, the global South, adults are sitting around the table while you have those emotional people, irrational, that are making decisions that are hurting everybody. Well, they've been isolated. It's interesting what the collective West keeps on saying, Russia being isolated, Iran being isolated. It's not. It's exactly the opposite that is happening. Did you see there was two speeches? I think one was the Israeli and the other one was condemning Israel. And nobody applauded Israeli leader, and you had all the global South, huge applause at the UN. That is what is happening. The collective West is being ignored, and you see when Lavrov, there are meetings. When there was a G20, Lavrov was a rock star. Everybody wanted to shake hands with Lavrov. Do you think? Nobody
People are making excuses to get out of meetings with Blinken. They're like, "Wait, I think I left my notebook in the other room."
Even Americans, just think for a second. If you're an American or anybody, and there's going to be a speech by Biden, you're not going to be like, "Oh my God, Biden is going to be on TV."
What's he going to say? Well, you might if you like make jokes about all of his gaffes. I mean, it's required viewing.
but you see, when there's Putin, not only Russians are watching, but all the world, because you can hang on every single word. There's a nuance. There's so much. There's history. Every single speech of Putin, you're going to learn about strategy, wisdom, history. Biden, it's pathetic. And it's not only Biden. Just look at Baerbock, all those Western leaders. I mean, it's everything. Baerbock, every single sentence, she's going to say something stupid. And it's an embarrassment. The only thing they have for themselves is that they might look younger, they're like photogenic and so on. But you know what? You're supposed to lead. You're supposed to be a leader. You're supposed to manage a country. You're supposed to embody, somebody that is actually have a scientific approach that is going to lead your country to the next century. That's what people need. And that's what actually Putin and Xi Jinping are providing for both China and Russia.
Yeah. And actually, this next question fits right into what you're saying, Angela. It says the U.S. tries to tempt Arab countries and Iran into war, but with BRICS success on the horizon, they may not take the bait. What do you think? This is exactly what we're talking about. Yes. Yeah. The U.S. is out of time, and they're resorting to increasingly desperate measures to try to reassert control over each of these areas. They are managing these proxy wars or confrontations, and it's becoming increasingly dangerous by the day. And I hope that they're not. I hope the world moves past this. Here's another one. This is another important point to understand. Jews have been living in Iran for centuries. The largest population of Jews in the region outside of Israel is in Iran right now. So people who are saying this is about religion has absolutely nothing to do with religion. Jews, Arabs, and Christians have lived side by side for centuries. even right now in, say, Syria, there's ancient Christian communities that Muslims, Shia and Sunni, fought and died to protect against the U.S. armed, funded, and backed proxies. They stood and fought together and bled and died together to preserve this coexistence that has existed for centuries. So people need to keep that in mind. It has nothing to do with religion. It has everything to do with geopolitics and the U.S. attempting to transform, distort, twist religion into a wedge issue. And that's what they do with these toxic ideologies that we talked about earlier. Zionism, Islamic extremism, Nazism, all three of which exist and are perpetuated today because of deliberate efforts by the U.S. to keep them going. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, that was the U.S. who was arming them for over a decade now, from the end of the beginning of the Arab Spring all the way up until now. That was the U.S. doing that. Nazis in Ukraine and all across Eastern Europe, that was the U.S. doing that. And Zionism would not exist in Israel today if it wasn't for the U.S. encouraging it, protecting it, and perpetuating it. We got to really keep that in mind. And this is a good one. I heard Alex Christoforou in a video, I think today, going over this. Yes, absolutely. Netanyahu talking about biblical holy wars. This is for the evangelical Christians in America that, they just blindly follow and believe and support Israel. They don't care what reality says. They're going to support Israel. They think something in the Bible said something about something, so they're all waiting for that, and they're going to support that. And it's a deliberate political distortion of religion that they've probably millions of Americans are goaded along this false path, and it's disastrous. It's the American version of these extremist groups in the Middle East or Zionism in Israel. And so, yeah, that was meant to target Americans, not it. So that's what Alex Christoforou said. I think it's right on.
Interesting to see that the most radical Zionists are not even living in Israel. I mean, would you want to live in Israel? They're powerful people, but they live in the U.S. They have French passport. I mean, they might go once in a while to Israel, but the most radical would you want to live in such a country? I mean, really, because it's a country at war. It is not nice to live in a country where you have those tensions. You have checkpoints. Israel is at war, even when outside of those days. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've gone over an hour and a half. I think we've addressed pretty much everything that I wanted to. Oh, there's one last one. Let's see what you think about this one too, Angela. If Russia can invade Ukraine, why can't Israel invade Gaza? I get this often. What is the common denominator here that we've been talking about on and on endlessly about? The U.S. is the common denominator here. The U.S. overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2014. From that point onward, Ukraine had no sovereignty. It was a politically captured state, subordinated to Washington, being transformed into a militant battering ram against Russia, a direct threat to Russia's national security. They were waging a war against their own people, Russian-speaking Ukrainians across the entire country, threatening Crimea, which voted in a referendum to join the Russian Federation. This is why Russia intervened. They didn't just out of the blue invade Ukraine. Ukraine ceased to have any sovereignty from 2014 onward. In many ways, Russia is intervening to end this political capture of Ukraine by the United States and its allies. Israel going into Gaza is just a blatant violation of international law. They are already blatantly occupying Palestinian territory, and now they're carpet bombing Gaza. I mean, I don't know how anyone, no matter how deluded you are, you're watching what Israel's doing to Gaza, and you're interpreting that as self-defense. I haven't seen anyone rationally explain it. What I hear people do is just openly vent their hatred and their disgust of the Palestinian people, who they don't even see as humans. And when you're doing that type of behavior, look in the mirror. That is really important to do some self-reflection on it, because you're not anywhere near reality.
Well, what they have in common, those two projects are to genocide. Clearly, in Ukraine, it was about genocide of ethnic cleansing of Russian speakers, and what you have in Israel is ethnic cleansing of Arabs and Muslims. That's what they have in common. So it's a bit different, but still lots of similarities. It was created by the U.S. the West on the first place, divide and conquer. Always the same strategy.
Yeah. So this is what I always hear. I hear people say, if Crimea can join the Russian Federation, why can't Taiwan become independent? Again, because the U.S. is involved in both cases, violating the sovereignty of different nations and stirring this up. It is not a natural process where the people pursuing this independence, say in Taiwan, are pursuing their best interest. Demonstrably, they are not. They are walking off a cliff, just like Ukraine just walked off a cliff, just like Israel is walking off a cliff. It's very, very important to remember there are objective realities that no amount of opinion or ideology can paper over. Very important to understand that. Angela, have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, just I think people need to. It's important this, just to be. We are all emotional. This is a very emotional question. We are all very divided, but at some point we need to cool down, take a step back, and really look at the history, the participant, and how we can solve the issue. What was the source of the issue? And we see lots of common points between all those different conflicts. And most of the time, and the problem is that it's the U.S. empire and how it comes in and divide and conquer. And we are misled. In the case of Israel, very often it has nothing to do with probably Israelis and Jews are the first victims. Palestinians are, of course, the first victims, but there are Israelis and Jews are also victims, also because the Zionist project itself was not for them. It was against them. It was for using them. Same as Ukraine. Ukraine, the West never cared. They just saw Ukrainians as pawns and they are going to use them. If they have to kill all the Ukrainians, it's okay. And the same in Israel. Don't think for a second that the West cares about Israelis and Jews. If they can use them for their political agenda, hegemonical agenda, they will. They will. So this misconception is not, the Jews that are conspiracy and so on. Don't fall into that trap. I would say this is really important. It's absurd. It's really absurd. And it can be very counterintuitive. So sometimes it's not like it's good just to challenge the easy path, easy assumption, including the big question mark of what happened the 7th of October. We will need to get back to this, and I think. Same as 9/11. 9/11 took a long time just for people just to realize what really happened. That question will be essential to really understand who were the participants. And again, to whom cui bono, to whom benefits the crime.
Yeah, exactly. And I keep wanting to wrap things up, but there's this. Israel voted in the UN to condemn China for Xinjiang Uyghurs. While they are genociding Gaza, and the accusations of Xinjiang genocide were utterly fabricated. There's zero evidence of that. And I just want to talk about Daniel Dumbrell's new video. Came out 2 days ago, and I posted it everywhere because I thought it was excellent. And I'm gonna put the link in the comment section right now.
Yes, people follow Daniel Dumbrell. Is a great. He's actually back to doing videos. He took a pause on making videos, but he's a really good channel to follow.
Yeah, and so check that video out because he talks all about the rank hypocrisy of the United States and how there are no principles. They don't stand for anything. It's, can this advance my foreign policy objectives or not? And if it can, I will use it. And if it can, I will trample it. That's how they view policies and also people. and their proxies, as Angelo was just pointing out. So let's see. So check that out. I just put the link in the comment section, and it's also in the community posts on my YouTube channel, and also on Telegram and on Twitter. Super rich, killed in combat. Yeah, well, here's a good point too. The self-defense part. Well, yes, exactly. Israeli forces eventually got themselves organized, and they defeated this Hamas raid. They killed these fighters. A lot of these fighters were involved in the raid, and that was the self-defense part. But actually, not really, because they're illegally occupying Palestinian territory, and Palestinians have a right to fight back. And if they want this to stop, they have to stop breaking the law, and people will stop having a legitimate ability to defend themselves. And the only thing that I disagree with October 7th was targeting civilians. And again, if Iran did have an inordinate amount of influence over Hamas, they would act more like Hezbollah. And I've argued with people many times over this. They say, well, Lebanon isn't occupied by the Israelis. Yes, because Hezbollah threw Israel out. They used to be, and Hezbollah threw them out. Hamas, if it operated more like Hezbollah, could also at least be on the path toward doing that, rather than provoking and perpetuating this conflict. And I'm not talking about all of Hamas, but I'm talking about the militants involved in this.
Brian, I think this point of morality, it is a really important point. We don't have the answer right away, but I think Norman Finkelstein, he actually did some very interesting video. And you see, his family, he come from a Holocaust survivor, so he has some kind of legitimacy here. And he was actually taking the example of people in concentration camps that are, they've been exterminated, and at some point just being able just to get out of the concentration camp. And what do you do? And that's an example, but also looking at other fights that of liberation and so on. This is war, and the morality was that if you were in that concentration camp and you have an opportunity to get out, and you have a few hours, you need to put yourself into their shoes. The morality, I think it's too easy for people from the outside just to understand for a second what it is about. But it's just desperate. The only thing is that I'm trying to take a step back also, just to look at what does it do to the common good for Palestinians. But I think we need to be really careful not to oversimplify. We had Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. He was labeled terrorist.
They said he was a terrorist, but you have to, yeah.
They say no. What I'm saying is that they say, but also they say that as many examples, Israel, when they were creating the land of Israel, they would kill the British army. They were putting bombs and so on. I think that morality, it's we need not to simplify too much. It's just I wouldn't go to the extent to say that was terrorism. I don't know. It's a war of liberation, and as you said just before, it's they're occupied. They are settlers. I think they have a part of responsibility too, somehow. But it can be challenged, and I think we need to accept different opinions. But to my opinion, that's it's part of the war. War is not. You have collateral damage. That's collateral damage. Yeah. We cannot. Is it like whole Hamas? That's individuals.
I'm not sure if Hamas wasn't documented, maneuvered into power by Israel, and if they didn't spend like almost 10 years fighting alongside U.S. and Israeli arms militants in Syria against Syria, Iran, Russia, I might think that along those lines, but I'm a little too cynical. I've seen this happen already. I've heard similar arguments regarding the Arab Spring. And what's amazing is many of the same, almost exact same people who fell for the Arab Spring are way too eager to just buy into the ideological, emotional narratives and not be more careful and look into the reality of what's happening. And again, I mean, I understand that the people living in Gaza, you just look at the video, it's unreal, it's hell on earth. But at the same time, Hamas fighters left Gaza to go kill Syrians and Iranians, Hezbollah in Syria, when they have this problem brewing in Gaza. I don't know. It's just the West has a long track record of manipulating and maneuvering these groups. We have to be mindful of that. We can't just say, oh, they, again, just like 9/11 and Al Qaeda, the U.S. brought this on themselves. No, the U.S. did bring it on themselves deliberately, so they had a pretext to spend 20 years marauding across the planet, killing and displacing millions and millions of people. So, ultimately, I tend to find the most balanced and constructive stances from the Russian and Chinese government. Also, ASEAN, very surprising. They said ceasefire, condemning all attacks on both sides on civilians, but not minimizing the right of the Palestinian people to resist occupation. And I think that is the point that and the UN. I really don't pay attention to what anyone in the UN says, but there was I think Angela, what is his name? Someone in the comment section, tell me what his name is. He was speaking out against Israel, and he laid out a very he said they shouldn't have killed civilians, but look at the context of all of this, and that we could all agree on that. We could all agree on that.
Absolutely. I think the stance of Russia and China is very pragmatic. I think, but what shocks me is that you don't have, in the collective West, you don't have a country that is. They're talking about humanitarian pause, but they're not. It's about stopping the hostilities, just to stop war. That should be the message. You stop war, and then you find a solution for the Palestinian question. Should be as simple as that. And I think most of us we do understand. After it's about morality, the 7 October, well, those are details. But I think 2 points: stop, the killing of civilians. You can stop right away, and then you find a solution. As simple as that. Because if you don't do that, you perpetuate this vicious circle of repeating a similar war every 4 to 5 years.
Yeah, and again, a question like this, I don't think anyone can honestly, in good faith, say what Israel is doing right now is a reasonable response to what happened. It clearly isn't. It isn't. We all know it isn't. And this is the whole point. It's just like, what did the U.S. do after 9/11? Was that a reasonable response to 9/11? No, they invaded every single country except the one that actually was funding and harboring Al Qaeda. It was all of America's allies in the region that were arming and funding and perpetuating Al Qaeda. The U.S. used it as a pretext to invade every other country that actually had nothing to do with Al Qaeda or who were enemies of Al Qaeda. So again, we have to be very careful. It's already happened. This isn't something new or novel. Anyway, we're at 2 hours. I want to thank you, Angelo, for taking time again taking time out of your Friday to join us and talk about these issues. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. Please check the video description for other places you can find and follow both my work and also Angelo's and support Angelo's work. And I will add the link to Daniel's video in the comment section, pinned comment at the top of the comment section. And we'll try to get back to live streams maybe again next week on Friday. Thanks again, Angelo. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. Until next time, bye for now.